Hi everybody. I'm going to carry on reading Journey to the River Sea today. We're on chapter 8, just flicked ahead, and chapter 8 is quite a long one again, so I'm going to stop halfway through so that you're not having to sit and listen to a big chunk of reading. So we'll do this half of chapter 8 today, and then the second half later on in the week, probably Friday. Okay? Right, let's get started. So chapter 8. Clovers had come up the river in an old tramp steamer. Oh, before I start, Moz is also there, because he wanted to hear it as well. He can't get enough of it at the moment. So, Clovers had come up the river in an old tramp steamer which carried anything from cattle to timber. He had paid the last of his money to the captain, who had allowed him to crouch on deck between a crate of bleating nanny goats and a leaking sack of maize. But he wouldn't put Clovis off at the carter's landing stage. "Bad place," he said, and he made Clovis get out into the old jetty higher up and walk back along the bank, so that by the time he reached the bungalow he was scratched and tired and very hot. But now, as he made his way up the gravel path to the house, his spirits rose. It was so neat and tidy and quiet. No chickens to give you fleas, no barking dogs running the length of their chains. Dusk had fallen and 2 of the windows were lit up. Clovis walked quietly towards them and looked in. He saw a most comforting sight. The Carters were having supper, sitting around a large table spread with clean white cloth. He could see Mrs. Carter, a kind-looking plump woman in a blue dress with frilly sleeves, serving something onto pudding plates, a pink blancmange. Clovis could see it shaking a little on the dish, and his mouth watered. Shape, his foster mother had called it. She made it with strawberries and cornflour and milk, fresh from the cow. Opposite Mrs. Carter there was her husband, a thin man in gold-rimmed spectacles, and facing him the twins. They looked just the way Maya had described them on the boat, pretty and dressed in white with ribbons in their hair. And beside them, Maya. The twins were pretty, but Maya was special, with her serious face and kind eyes. He could see her pigtail looped over her shoulder. Just looking at it made him feel safe, as if he could hold on to it and be all right. Miss Minton didn't seem to be there. Perhaps it was her day off and she'd gone to visit friends. He stood and looked a little longer, unseen by the people in the room. It was a good name for this house, Teperini, a place of rest. Then he went round to the side of the house and knocked on the door. It only took a few moments to shatter Clovis's dream. First came the violent shrilling of an alarm bell, then a maid with a sullen face led him to the dining room and opened the door, and the twins looked up, stared at him and exploded. It wasn't laughter that came from them, not really. It was that awful giggling, that high-pitched, merciless titter that had spread across the footlights in the theatre and set the other children off. Clovis recognised it at once. So it was the twins' laughter which had hounded him. "Oh," gasped Beatrice, "it's little Lord Fauntleroy." And then both girls said, "Will I have to stop being your little boy?" in a deep, growly voice, and repeated it, their voices getting lower and lower. And in between they choked and spluttered and patted each other on the back and started taunting him again. Clovis stood perfectly still by the door. He looked at Maya to see if she too was going to join in, but she looked horrified, and now she jumped up and came to stand beside him. "Don't," she said passionately to the twins. "Please don't. Can't you see?" Mrs. Carter now took charge. "All right, girls," she said to her daughters, "that will do." And to Maya, "Sit down, please. We have not finished our meal." But it took some time for the twins to quieten down. They still growled and gulped, and then Beatrice said, "Look at Maya protecting her boyfriend." "Enough," said Mr. Carter, dabbing his mouth with his napkin. It was the first word he'd spoken at the table, and was to be the last. But the twins now managed to control themselves. "Now," said Mrs. Carter, staring at Clovis, "might I ask what brings you here?" Clovis looked at the soft, rounded face. Close to, it did not look kind and motherly as it had done through the window. He felt that under those puffy cheeks one would find stone. "I wondered if I could stay with you for a few days. We have to leave the hotel, all of us, and I thought—" His words died away. Maya now turned to Mrs. Carter and stretched out her hands as if she was begging for her life. "Oh, please, please, Mrs. Carter, couldn't he stay? He could have my room and I'd go and sleep with Miss Minton. I'm sure Mr. Murray will help to—" "Stay?" Mrs. Carter interrupted in a horrified voice. "Stay with us," said Beatrice. "We don't have actors to stay, do we, Gwendolen?" Both twins shook their heads slowly, left to right, and then right to left. They reminded Maya of the women knitting by the guillotine during the French Revolution, while heads rolled into baskets. "Heaven knows what he might have picked up in the Paradiso," said Mrs. Carter, and to Clovis, "What are those bites on your legs? Fleas or bedbugs?" Clovis flushed. There were bedbugs at the Paradiso. He minded it just as much as Mrs. Carter, but it was true that he no longer looked like a boy wonder on the stage. It had been impossible to get hot water at the hotel. His long hair was unwashed, his clothes were too small for him and stained. "We can't just turn him out," said Maya desperately. "I hope you don't think we can take in every verminous stray that comes to the door. The boy must go back. Beatrice, go and fetch Miss Minton." "I'll go," said Maya quickly. "No, I asked Beatrice." But Gwendolen, who wouldn't even go to the bathroom by herself, had slipped out after her sister. Maya had not sat down again. She stood beside Clovis, as though she could come between him and his misery. In its bowl at the centre of the table, the pink shape, which had looked so good through the window, had sunk into a watery mush. Miss Minton appeared in the doorway. "Good evening, Clovis," she said. Clovis took a step towards her. "Good evening, Miss Minton." She looked as though she'd had looked on the boat. Sharp-faced and strong. He'd liked that from the start. She was fierce, but she was straight, and for a moment he was sure she would be able to help him. "Please take the boy out and order Furo to take him back to Manaus at once," ordered Mrs. Carter. "Oh, not tonight," begged Maya. "Surely." "Tonight. I hope you're satisfied making us use the boat and wasting fuel on a runaway boy." Miss Minton gave Maya a quelling look. "That will do, Maya. Come along, Clovis. I'm really ashamed of you putting the Carters at so much trouble." Clovis shook off her arm and gave up hope. "I'll come by myself," he said. If Miss Minton, too, was his enemy, there was nothing to be done. The two Englishmen had returned from upriver in a very nasty temper. They spent 2 days on a boat with piglets and chickens and an old woman who was seasick even though the river hardly moved in the still heat. There were no bunks, only hammocks strung on deck, and Mr. Trapwood fell out of his in the middle of the night onto an inspector of schools from Rio, who was not pleased. Even worse had befallen Mr. Lowe, who had decided to have a swim when the boat stopped to take on more wood, and came out of the water to find a dozen blood-sucking leeches feasting on his behind. And when they got to the Ombuda, there was no sign of Bernard Taverner's son. The interpreter, whom Colonel de Silva had sent with them, was very helpful. He went ahead to the chief of Ombuda and greeted him in his own language and said that Mr. Lowe and Mr. Trapwood were important people who had come from Great Britain to search for a missing boy. But what he also said in a low voice was that these two gentlemen were being a great trouble to the colonel, who begged the chief and his friends to tell them some story about a lost boy, which would keep them quiet to make them go away again. The Ombuda chief and his friends were only too pleased to do this. They didn't like Mr. Lowe and Mr. Trapwood, who had not brought any of the presents one usually brings when visiting a tribe, fish hooks and knives and cooking pots, and they loved making up stories. So they told them about an English boy, fair-haired and beautiful as the sun, who had been here, but had wandered away again. "Where to?" asked the crows eagerly. "Where did he go?" "In the direction of the sacred mountain," said the chief, pointing to the north. No, in the direction of the Mambuto forest," said his second-in-command, pointing in the opposite direction. "Forgive me, father," said the chief's young son, "but the boy went to the river," and pointed somewhere completely different again. "Ask them when this was," said Mr. Trapwood excitedly. So the Indians and the interpreter talked among themselves, and then they went to a hut to the edge of the clearing and fetched out an old woman. The old woman wasn't just old, she was ancient, with arms and legs like sticks, and not a tooth in her head. But when the chief explained what he wanted, she grinned happily and said, yes, she remembered the boy very well. His eyes were as blue as the blossom of the jacaranda tree, and his hair glistened like a belly in the golden toad that squats on the lily leaves of the Mamari River, said the old woman, who was having a good time. His skin was as white as the moon in the season of— "Yes, but when? When?" interrupted the crows rudely. "When was he here?" The old woman sat down on a tree stump and began to count. She used her fingers and toes and then some pebbles on the ground, and the chief and his friends helped her. Then she winked at the interpreter and said it had been 50 years ago. "What?" shouted Mr. Trapwood. 50 years? She nodded and said, Yes, she was sure, because it was when she was a very small girl and she still had all of her milk teeth in her head. And the Indians nodded also and said yes, she had often told them of the lost boy who came when she was no higher than the tail of a swamp deer. And they led her back to the hut, patting her on the back while she giggled with glee. So the crows had to give up, but they could not leave because the boat back to Manaus was not due for another 2 days, and they had a very uncomfortable time staying with the Ombuda, who drummed a lot and seemed to live mostly on nuts. That the tribe was sharing their food and shelter very generously did not, of course, occur to the crows, who had been brought up to think of Indians as savages. By the time they returned to Manaus, the Englishmen were not in very good shape. "I've had enough of this," said Mr. Trapwood, as they sat in their room in the Pension Maria overlooking the docks. "So have I," croaked Mr. Lowe. "This business has got to be settled. The bishop goes back in 10 days' time, and the taverner boy is going to be on it." "If he exists," said Mr. Trapwood gloomily. "Of course he exists. You saw the letter." "Well, why doesn't he come forward, or anyone else? Do you think we ought to put up the reward? The old chap said we must use our judgment." "I suppose we might as well. After all, it's not us that's paying it. What we need now is a thorough house-to-house search of the buildings outside the city. If Taverner was a naturalist, he probably wouldn't live in the middle of a town, and they may not have seen the notices out there." "I'm sure that chap at the museum knows something," said Mr. Lowe moodily. "The one who said that Taverner didn't have a son." Then the little Brazilian maid brought in their supper, which was the same as lunch and the same as breakfast. Brown beans stewed with pig's trotters. Mr. Lowe dug about in it gloomily, looking for bits of gristle, and Mr. Trapwood found a dead ant on his plate. It seemed to be perfectly clean ant, but it gagged and pushed his plate away. "This place is closer to hell on earth than anywhere I've been," he said. On the morning after Clovers had been turned away from the house, the hairdresser came out from Manaus to do Mrs. Carter's hair. At first he was silent and surly, but when he found that Mrs. Carter meant to pay him at last, he cheered up and gave them all the news. The actors had all been thrown out of the Paradiso and had got hold of a lorry and were trying to get out of Brazil, though through Venezuela, where the British consul was supposed to be good-natured and inclined to turn a blind eye. "But everyone thinks he'll be stopped at the border," said Monsieur Claude. "Poor Clovis," said Maya when she heard this. The twins shrugged. "He's only an actor," said Beatrice. "A vagabond. They're used to wandering about." "Clovis isn't," said Maya, but she said no more about him. Since Clovis had been taken away by Miss Minton, she had been quiet and subdued, scarcely speaking to anyone. But the piece of news that interested the Carters the most was that the reward for the discovery of Taverner's son had been doubled. "It's 40,000 milre now," said the hairdresser, crimping Mrs. Carter's curls. "They've put up notices everywhere. Imagine the dresses that one could buy with that," said Beatrice. "And the hats," said Gwendolen. "And the shoes. And the chocolates. Boxes and boxes of chocolates." "You could buy something a great deal more useful than that," said Mr. Carter. The full set of glass eyes from Queen Victoria's piano tuner, for example. He'd seen it in the catalogue, or he could pay off that shark Gonzales from whom he'd borrowed money and who was always pestering him. "There's a new kind of wallpaper which stops insects from landing on it for 20 years, said Mrs. Carter, wistfully. "I read about it at the dentist." For a moment, all the Carters stood with narrowed eyes, thinking of what they would do with so much money. And on the following day, the crows arrived at the bungalow. Right, we are going to stop there. But it's getting good, isn't it? I wonder what's going to happen next. I certainly wouldn't want the crows turning up at my bungalow if I had one, because they don't seem like very nice people at all, do they? But I hope you're enjoying it still, and we will read the rest of Chapter 8 later on in the week. Hope you're all staying safe and well, and I'll see you soon. Lots of love. Bye.